Welcome to People, Power, and Politics. Hard talk, riveting interviews, community updates, in-depth analysis. That's People, Power, and Politics. We tell it to you as it is. No holds barred. You are the people. You have the power. We bring you the politics. To listen to our podcast, be a guest, or to advertise, visit www.pppradio.nyc. That's www.pppradio.nyc.
A very warm welcome to everyone. We are joined by a very special guest, Linda Tigani, who is the Chair and Executive Director of the Commission on Racial Equity Corps. On September the 12th, 2024, a pivotal moment was marked as the New York City Council voted to support passing legislation Intro 242 and Intro 279. This legislation is a crucial step in addressing centuries of discriminatory practices against Black New Yorkers and the entire BIPOC. This legislation aims to identify reparative measures to advance healing, racial equity, and social justice. It also establishes municipal efforts to acknowledge and address the legacy and impact of slavery and racial injustice in New York City. Welcome, Ms. Tigani. Such a pleasure and honor to have you here with us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having us on, and I'm excited to talk about this great work that New York City is embarking on.
You're very welcome. So before we talk about that, can you just give a brief introduction about your organization?
Sure. So the New York City Commission on Racial Equity was established through the November 2022 vote. We are an independent commission that was voted in to hold New York City government accountable to advancing racial equity in government operations and increase community voice in government decision-making. So when the voters went to the poll, they had the opportunity to consider several equity measures, which included this commission that I run, but it also included asking if New Yorkers wanted every city agency to have a racial equity plan, and they said yes. It included asking New Yorkers if they wanted the city to measure the true cost of living, and they said yes. If they wanted the city to have an office of racial equity, so the office that would develop the template, pull all the agencies together, and create a citywide racial equity plan, and they said yes. And they also said yes to having a chief equity officer. So we are one of several ballot measures that came out of historic uprising against the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, but also many of the names of New Yorkers, countless New Yorkers who have died at the hands of police violence and or racial violence. This also came after high levels of anti-Asian violence. And New Yorkers said that they wanted to put a permanent stop to race-based violence, to bias, to discrimination. And they also wanted to ensure that our government was taking the necessary action to ensure that all New Yorkers, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their gender identity, their cultural background, that they were able to thrive in New York City, to be safe and to live full lives.
Okay, thank you so much. So we spoke briefly about the legislation Intro 242 and 279 that was passed, and you said we are not responsible for what breaks us up, but we can be responsible for what puts us back together again. Naming the hurt is how we begin to repair our broken parts, and that quote, which you said in a statement, is attributed to Desmond Tutu. So can you explain the significance of the recent New York City Council legislation in addressing historical injustices and racial inequities?
Sure. So Desmond Tutu continues to be an inspiration for healing work around the world, and certainly for being a leader and helping to inspire and create a model for what truth, healing, and reconciliation commissions can do. So sort of beginning with where we are in New York City and the historic work of the ballot measures. One critical component to the ballot measures was that New Yorkers said that they wanted a preamble to our New York City Charter, which is our Constitution. And it outlines how New York City government executes on its obligations, what authority it has, what power it has. And that's really important to uplift here because New Yorkers said, we want to make sure that people understand that government in New York City must acknowledge, and now this is pulling directly from the preamble, must acknowledge the grave injustices and atrocities that form part of our country's history, including the forced labor of enslaved Africans and the colonialism that displaced indigenous people from their lands, the devaluing and underpaying of immigrant workers, and the discrimination and racial segregation, mass incarceration, and all other forms of violence that perpetuate systemic inequity. And I'm uplifting that here because New York City in the North historically is sort of represented as the safe haven for enslaved Africans, when in fact, the Equal Justice Initiative, as well as several other researchers, tell us that almost half of New Yorkers in 1730 owned enslaved Africans. This is a higher percentage than any other colonial city except for Charleston, South Carolina. We are also home to one of the oldest and largest African burial grounds. And it's critical to acknowledge and recognize and honor the ancestors that are here with us who have called for reparations, the way in which they guide our work day to day. And also acknowledging that with New York City being a financial capital, both considered for the country and some consider financial capital for the world, it's extremely important that we take on direct action that allows us to live out our preamble and that really challenges both the history, making sure that our people's history is uplifted, that there's truth telling to it, and that in the financial capital of the world, we're saying we are committed to investing our city funds in a way that uplifts racial equity, that uplifts being able to thrive in New York City, and that ends the legacy of slavery.
You're very well said. So, what are the main objectives of the Truth, Healing, and Reconciliation process outlined in Introduction 242A, and how does CORE plan to implement this process effectively?
Sure. So 242A focuses on developing a plan for a truth, healing, and reconciliation process. And so I just want to uplift that this first part is really bringing people together to talk about what could this look like? What should it include? And the legislation provides some guidance to ensure that we are thinking about multiple parts and certainly centering people. Specifically, CORE is focused on centering communities that are historically underrepresented and underserved. And so already we're talking about Black New Yorkers, Brown New Yorkers, and the BIPOC community. And so uplifting that particular definition of who is going to be the focus of our engagement, the legislation says that we're to not only think about what are the questions that we're asking people, how are we engaging them in telling us their stories, but also what type of public information campaign are we planning to develop to make sure that all New Yorkers know that this is happening? Where can we host these sessions? What should these sessions look like? And how can we create an inclusive process? The plan is really going to outline what and how we can do this work and keep people physiologically and psychologically safe while doing this, making sure that we're uplifting the healing components, that we're acknowledging that we're really asking people to open up their existing wounds. And we need to be responsible for that. And so how are we including faith communities and spiritual communities in this work? And that this both is presented in a historical context, and the data that we should be looking at and the way that we examine what it is that people put forward as solutions, which we understand in the legislation, solutions is referenced as recommendations, right? Reparative recommendations. To really truly understand that, we have to establish historical facts. We have to be able to talk about what's been denied as a fact, but in actuality are people's truths, and uplift that in this process. And part of the plan is going to be to preserve and memorialize the work that we're doing. People are going to share their history, their family's history, and how the legacy of slavery shows up in their day-to-day life. And we need to make sure to honor that in the way that we really should be honoring our ancestors every single day. So we are asked to put together a comprehensive plan, and we plan to work with communities across New York City and do right by our enslaved African ancestors who created this city, like built this city with their hands, and make sure that the appropriate context, the historical and social context, the facts about their life, as well as the lives of their descendants right now, is centered in this work. And that's actually where we see a lot of connection with Bill 279A and why there's synergy between them.
And that takes me to Bill 279A, which calls for a study of the historical and present-day role of New York City government in racial injustices. So what areas will the study focus on, and how will the findings influence future policies?
Sure. So what is really, I think, unique about this particular call for a study, and also works well within the mission and vision of CORE, is that the study really seeks to understand the role of governing bodies and agencies of the city of New York in perpetuating historical and ongoing impacts of slavery and its legacies. So it's really saying, like, let's take a look at how our agencies, and really the birth of our agencies and the birth of our policies, how is that perpetuating the legacy of slavery? How many of those agencies or policies were created during Jim Crow, were created during segregation? You know, we are coming up as a city on the 400th year anniversary of the incorporation of New York City. And 400 years ago, we had enslaved African labor, right? So how are we honoring our ancestors in that work? This particular study, I believe, one, will cross all the social determinants of health. So when we talk about the impact of slavery and its current legacy, we're talking about how does racial discrimination show up right now in our segregated school system? How is it showing up in our maternal mortality rates, in our health insurance and healthcare policies, and our housing policy? We often as a city talk about the impact of redlining and how we still feel that today. And because of that, we have segregated neighborhoods, and therefore we have segregated schools, and we have food deserts, and we have areas where it's extremely difficult to get to a hospital or an urgent care, or the quality of care is not equal. So it's a little, for us right now, premature to say which exactly would be the focus or how we're going to build a plan that pulls everything together. But I just want to uplift that the study focus is going to touch across the board on all the aspects of our lives as New Yorkers, particularly as Black New Yorkers, and what we need to have come to fruition through community engagement with Black New Yorkers, with New Yorkers in the BIPOC community, with researchers, is to really understand what are the main themes and threads across all of the areas of our life that would present a study focus. But we need to be able to move through the process before we can name exactly what those are.
Okay, so you mentioned the need for reparative measures. What reparative actions are being considered, and how will these measures be decided upon and implemented?
Sure. So right now, we know that reparative measures are needed because New Yorkers have said this for years, right? We have ongoing advocacy specifically around racial injustice. And that, again, brings back the discussion around ending the impact of redlining, the conditions for Black and Brown women to give birth, or birthing individuals to be able to give birth safely and live, be able to provide racially equitable funding to schools and undo the historic disinvestment in our schools. In a lot of ways, we're really talking about being able to put action to the Brown versus Board of Education ruling that was handed down 70 years ago, and we are still facing deep levels of segregation and unequal investment. So when we talk about reparative measures in this moment, CORE looks to what did New Yorkers tell us about the draft community equity priorities that relate to our first charter mandate as a commission, where people talked about the need for housing, the inability to be able to pay rent right now, and how can we change that? We heard from New Yorkers that food is expensive, and it's not that this is happening everywhere, but we are seeing this in communities of color. We do expect that there will be some synergy between what we heard from over 4,000 New Yorkers in the draft community equity priority process, the feedback for that, and what we expect New Yorkers will tell us about the reparative actions that they want to be considered. But we want to be mindful that while we have a history of what New Yorkers want, they are not shy, right? New Yorkers of people of color are not shy in telling us what they need, nor should they be. This is their right. They have a right to live safely, freely, and with the resources that they need to thrive. And we are expecting that some of the reparations measures will align with some of the current campaigns that we see day to day.
Okay, so can you describe how CORE will involve affected communities in shaping the truth healing and reconciliation process?
Sure. So we are in the process of thinking through what this could look like. And our first and most immediate next step is that the mayor is going to hopefully will sign the legislation. And then we will begin to think through and negotiate how much money the city is able to put behind these two particular bills. Being able to name how communities can show up is extremely important to us. And so it is important to make sure that we have these first two pieces in place. We have always centered community in our work at CORE. That's why we were able to reach over 4,000 New Yorkers in our first cycle of engagement. And we plan on building with those New Yorkers, with the organizations that have partnered with us, as well as with what I believe is a very robust group in New York City, several groups in New York City that have been fighting for reparations. We really center community voice and work to make sure that community voices are influencing our decisions as well. You know, as a part of our mission statement, we are really focused on increasing community voices in government decision making, and that means that voices should be influencing that. And the Commission on Racial Equity is a part of government, and so we do want to model what we want other agencies to be able to pick up as well.
Okay, and how does the recent legislation fit into the broader goals of racial equity and social justice in New York City, and what are CORE's next step following this legislative milestone?
So with respect to how does the recent legislation fit into the broader goals, we have heard from over 4,000 New Yorkers that the reparative measures that they are looking for that address the current racial injustices around housing, education, healthcare, legal services, mass incarceration, over policing, we are able to see, just based off of the reports that are coming out from across the nation, from other commissions that are studying reparations, and also knowing some of New York City's history, we do expect to see some alignment with what New Yorkers are asking for now, also because New Yorkers have been asking for this for decades. You know, New Yorkers have been asking for police accountability for decades. So we do expect to see that in the work that we are going to do with community. And the broader goals around racial equity and social justice are really outlined in the New York City Charter preamble around the recognition, the acknowledgement of racial injustice. And we have three overarching fundamental values in that preamble. The first is to note that our government justly values all talents and contributions. The second is that our government ensures the condition of thriving for everyone. And then the third is that our government embraces vigilance, remedy, and reconstruction. And I think this particular work is embodied in this last fundamental value, with embracing reconstruction and really pushing for clear structural change in the way that government operates so that we can actually put a final end to bias, discrimination, and racism and the legacy of slavery in our city, and certainly to support the other counties and cities that have been doing this work on a national level. So our next step is to continue, one, learning from other counties, from other municipalities, from other commissions, as we wait for the legislation to be signed, for funding to be secured, and then to roll out a plan to do deep community engagement throughout this process. And we would love for community to be able to help inform the development of how we plan to do this work, in addition to being a part of every public meeting, of every open conversation, for every request for comment or feedback, for community to feel, one, that they co-own this process with us and that they are being heard, and that two, that they are influencing all parts of the decision-making process here.
Okay. And finally, Ms. Tigani, as a leading figure in the fight for racial equity and social justice in New York City, what message would you like to convey to New Yorkers about their role in this initiative and the collective effort to dismantle generational harm and build a more equitable city?
I would say it's important to note, and core practices this in our work, and I'm honored to say that all of my team members and all of the commissioners also practice this in their work and hold this as a core value, that racial equity and justice in the form of reparations, truth, healing, reconciliation cannot and will not happen without community. And they are central to this work. Community is absolutely central to this work. And we understand that not only do their voices need to be at the table, and not only do we need to increase the number of voices at the table, but that we need to make sure that their voices are leading to long-standing structural change. We do not take this work lightly, and we will do this work with them.
Okay, so how can one contact your organization, get more information?
Sure. So you're welcome to visit our website, which is www.nyc.gov/core, CORE. You can also follow us on social media at Racial Equity NYC. We are on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. We have a contact us page through our website, but you could also reach out to us on social media. And you're welcome to email askcore@core.nyc.gov.
So thank you so much, Ms. Linda Tigani, who is the Chair and Executive Director of the Commission of Racial Equity Core. It has been such a privilege and honor speaking with you. Thank you so much for sharing this great information with us.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. Thank you for having us, and we look forward to coming back and sharing updates with you and your community.
Excellent. Will do. Thank you so much again.
This show is a production of IQ Inc. Marketing. If you would like to advertise your product or service on this show to the U.S. and Caribbean markets and through our multicultural publications in New York, please call 866-435-3286 or send an email to info@myiqinc.com.
People, Power, and Politics. Hard talk, riveting interviews, community updates, in-depth analysis. That's People, Power, and Politics. We tell it to you as it is. No holds barred. You are the people, you have the power. We bring you the politics. To listen to our show, be a guest, or to advertise, visit www.pppradio.nyc. That's www.pppradio.nyc.